A gang storms a subway station, mocking and threatening a fat black man they believe is helpless. Little do they know, he's a retired professional boxer with a past he's tried to leave behind. What will happen when the gang pushes him too far? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The subway station was alive with the usual chaos of the morning rush. The rhythmic clatter of trains echoed through the underground tunnels, mingling with the muffled conversations of commuters and the occasional wail of a busker's saxophone. The air carried a mix of freshly brewed coffee, engine oil, and the distant tang of subway grease. It was the heart of the city, a hub where lives intersected for brief moments before diverging again. Among the crowd, Isaiah Zay Johnson sat on a worn bench near the platform's edge, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, a paperback novel in his hands. Zay's large frame made him an imposing figure, but the kind eyes behind his glasses softened the impression. He was dressed in a simple button-up shirt that stretched slightly over his belly and dark slacks that had seen better days. His presence, while quiet, was familiar to those who frequented the station. The regulars nodded or offered small smiles as they passed him. He'd often been seen helping a struggling mother carry a stroller up the stairs or stopping a lost tourist to point them in the right direction. He was well-liked but not often noticed, a fixture in the backdrop of the bustling station. What most didn't know was that Zay had once been someone extraordinary. Years ago, he was a force to be reckoned with in the boxing world. Nicknamed the gentle juggernaut for his deceptive speed and unmatched endurance, he had fought his way to fame and respect. But fame wasn't everything. The brutal reality of the sport, and a tragedy that shook him to his core, had driven Zay out of the ring. Since then, he had sought a quieter life, trading his gloves for the anonymity of the city's subway station. Today was no different. Zay flipped a page of his book, occasionally glancing up to observe the ebb and flow of humanity around him. There was comfort in the routine. The train screeched to a halt, releasing a flood of passengers. A busker strummed a cheerful tune on his guitar, earning a few scattered coins. A teenager leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone as he waited for his ride. But not all the signs were comforting. Near the far end of the platform, graffiti had begun creeping up the walls, bold and jagged letters scrawled in a way that marked territory rather than expressed art. The remnants of a broken beer bottle glittered in a dark corner, and an uneasy hush fell over certain groups when the subject of the area came up. A shopkeeper in the station's small newsstand leaned in toward a regular customer, her voice low. "Have you heard? That group's been hanging around again, causing trouble for everyone." Zay caught snippets of the conversation and frowned slightly. He didn't need to look to know who they were talking about. He had noticed it himself, the shadows lingering in corners, the way certain faces tensed and hurried when they crossed particular paths. A new gang had started to claim the station as their own, and their growing presence was unmistakable. At that moment, a young girl dashed toward the edge of the platform, her small figure wobbling precariously close to the yellow line. Zay's eyes snapped up, and in an instant, he was moving. "Hey," he called out, his deep voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The girl froze, startled, just as her mother caught up and pulled her back. The woman turned to Zay with a grateful nod. "Thank you," she said breathlessly. Zay waved it off with a small smile, but his eyes lingered on the mother and child as they walked away. It wasn't just the gang that made this station feel off lately. The tension in the air felt heavier than usual, as though something was brewing just beneath the surface. He returned to his bench, but his usual calm was tinged with unease. The whispers of trouble were growing louder, and the graffiti was spreading. This was no longer the place he had come to know so well. As the next train screeched to a halt, Zay's gaze drifted toward the far end of the platform. A trio of figures leaned casually against the wall, their postures exuding false confidence and simmering menace. They weren't hiding. They wanted to be seen. Zay adjusted his glasses, his fingers tightening slightly around the edges of his book. He could see the writing on the wall, literally and figuratively. Trouble had arrived, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. For now, he kept his peace. But deep down, Zay knew something was about to change. The subway station buzzed with its usual noise, clattering trains, shuffling feet, and the occasional hum of a busker's guitar. It was an ordinary afternoon, or so it seemed. Isaiah Zay Johnson sat in his usual spot, a paperback balanced in his hands. Around him, the station thrummed with life, passengers weaving through the tunnels like ants in a colony. Then, the atmosphere changed. The first sign was subtle. The energy of the crowd shifted, conversation dipping into murmurs, laughter stifling itself into silence. People avoided looking in a particular direction, their movements growing hurried and deliberate. Zay glanced up from his book, his sharp eyes catching the arrival of a group descending the staircase. Marcus Slim Taylor led the way, his tall, wiry frame draped in a leather jacket that flared slightly as he moved. His sharp features carried an air of smug superiority, and a faint smirk danced at the edges of his lips. Behind him were his crew, 3 men whose postures screamed aggression. They moved like wolves entering a sheep pen, scanning the station with predatory intent. Slim reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, his eyes sweeping the station like he owned it. A cigarette dangled from his lips, the faint curl of smoke rising and mixing with the stale subway air. "All right, fellas," Slim drawled, his voice cutting through the station like a blade. "Let's see what this dump has to offer today." His companions chuckled, spreading out slightly as Slim strode toward the platform. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, snatched a newspaper from a commuter's hands, tossing it into the air and laughing as the pages fluttered. Another leaned close to a woman standing by the vending machine, muttering something that made her flinch and clutch her purse tighter. Zay's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. The gang was trouble, that much was obvious. He set his book down on the bench, leaning forward slightly as his instincts sharpened. Nearby, an elderly woman struggled to retrieve her cane after it slipped from her hand. One of the gang members, a lanky man with a chain hanging from his belt, noticed her and sauntered over, kicking the cane just out of her reach. "What's the matter, Granny?" he sneered. "Lose something." The woman looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She reached for the cane again, but he stepped on it, pinning it to the ground with the heel of his boot. Slim's smirk widened as he watched, but before the gang member could continue, Zay rose from his seat. His large frame straightened, and he moved toward the scene with deliberate calm. The murmur of the station seemed to dim as his footsteps echoed against the tiled floor. "Excuse me," Zay said, his voice steady but firm. "She dropped that. Give it back." The lanky man looked up, his sneer faltering slightly as he took in Zay's size. But then he recovered, puffing out his chest and glaring back. "And who's gonna make me?" he shot back, his voice loud enough to draw Slim's attention. Zay didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his calm gaze meeting the gang member's defiant glare. "I'm asking politely," Zay said. "Don't make me ask again." Slim strolled over, his cigarette now dangling from his fingers. He tilted his head, studying Zay with a bemused expression. "Now this is interesting," Slim said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Big guy over here thinks he can tell us what to do." The gang burst into laughter, their voices echoing through the station. Zay ignored them, his attention focused on the woman. He crouched down, retrieving her cane and handing it to her with a reassuring nod. "Go on, ma'am," he said gently. "You're all right now." The woman nodded quickly, clutching her cane and hurrying off toward the escalators. Slim stepped closer, his smirk fading into something colder. He looked Zay up and down, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's your deal?" Slim said, his tone taking on an edge. "You some kind of hero?" Zay straightened, towering over Slim, but his expression remained calm. "Just looking out for my neighbors," Zay replied. The gang chuckled again, though their laughter was more forced now. The burly man with the shaved head stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Maybe you should look out for yourself," he growled. "Before you get hurt." Zay's gaze shifted to him, unblinking and steady. The intensity in his eyes made the man hesitate for just a moment. Slim, noticing the hesitation, laughed and clapped his hands together. "Relax, boys," he said. "Big guy here's just trying to play nice. Isn't that right?" Zay didn't respond. "Here's the thing," Slim continued, his voice lowering as he leaned in. "This station? It's ours now. And people like you," he jabbed a finger at Zay's chest. "You don't get to decide how things go down. Got it?" The tension in the air was palpable, and the subway carriages arriving in the background seemed quieter than usual. Commuters skirted around the scene, avoiding eye contact and disappearing into the shadows. Zay remained still, his expression unreadable. Then, he leaned slightly closer, his deep voice cutting through the gang's bravado. "You don't scare me," he said simply. Slim's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. He stepped back, gesturing for his crew to follow. "This ain't over," Big Man Slim said, his voice cold. "We'll see you around." The gang retreated toward the far end of the platform, their swagger less pronounced than when they'd arrived. Slim threw one last glance over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing before he disappeared up the stairs. Zay let out a slow breath, returning to his bench as the noise of the station resumed its rhythm. He picked up his book, though his grip on it was tighter than before. The air felt heavier now, the gang's presence leaving a lingering unease. Zay had faced trouble before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him. This was a warning. The subway station had become a simmering pot of unease. What was once a hub of bustling life now felt like a battleground under siege. Marcus Slim Taylor and his gang moved through the station like storm clouds, leaving tension and fear in their wake. The first signs were small but unmistakable. A corner kiosk selling newspapers and snacks was found covered in graffiti, the words Slim Station scrawled in jagged letters across the shutter. A busker who once filled the air with music was shoved aside, his guitar case kicked over, scattering the coins he had collected. People whispered about how the gang patrolled the platforms as if they owned the place, their mocking laughter and threats echoing through the tunnels. Zay saw it all. From his usual bench, he watched the gang escalate their antics, his grip tightening on his book with each incident. He wasn't one to meddle unnecessarily, but the subway station wasn't just a transit point for him. It was a second home, a place where familiar faces greeted him, where the hum of life felt steady and predictable. He couldn't stand by while fear took hold. Zay started to act, though always in ways that wouldn't draw attention. When he saw a teenager cornered near the vending machines by one of Slim's men, Zay intervened. He strolled up casually, his large frame casting a long shadow over the scene. "Hey," Zay said, his voice calm but firm. "You dropped this." He handed the boy a dollar bill, one he had quietly pulled from his own pocket, and shot the gang member a look that spoke volumes. The teenager bolted and the gang member, though reluctant, backed off, muttering under his breath. Another time, Zay stepped in when an elderly man was shoved aside near the ticket machines. The gang had taken to loitering near the machines, intimidating commuters into handing over loose change. Zay calmly escorted the man to safety, ignoring the snide remarks hurled at his back. "You're lucky we're feeling generous today." "Fat boy," one of the gang members called out. Zay didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. He knew it wouldn't end with words. Marcus Slim Taylor wasn't blind to Zay's presence. The gang's leader had started to notice how Zay's quiet defiance unsettled his crew. They didn't say it outright, but the way their bravado faltered when Zay was near spoke volumes. Slim hated it. He thrived on fear, on the control he could exert over others. And Zay? Zay wasn't playing along. One evening, Slim decided to make a move. The station was quieter than usual, the late hour thinning the usual crowd. Slim and his gang gathered near the main platform, their voices loud and grating. Zay was at his usual spot, a paperback in his hands, though his attention wasn't on the words. He could feel their eyes on him. "Yo, big guy," Slim's voice cut through the station, sharp and mocking. Zay glanced up, meeting Slim's gaze without a word. "You think you're better than us?" "Ha," Slim continued, stepping closer. His gang fanned out behind him, their movements slow and deliberate, meant to intimidate. Zay didn't rise. He simply closed his book, resting it on his lap. "I don't think about you at all," Zay replied, his tone even. Slim's grin twisted into a sneer. "That's so. You think you can walk around here, cleaning up after us like some janitor, and not face the consequences?" The gang laughed, but the sound lacked conviction. Zay's stillness was unnerving. Slim leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You don't belong here, old man. This is my station now." Zay stared at him, unblinking. "Then why are you so afraid of losing it?" The words hit their mark. Slim's face darkened, and for a moment it seemed like he might strike. Instead, he stepped back, his grin returning, though it was strained. "This isn't over," Slim said, pointing a finger at Zay. "You'll see." The gang followed Slim as he stalked off, but the tension lingered like smoke in the air. That night, Zay sat alone in his small apartment, the echoes of Slim's threat replaying in his mind. He stared at an old photograph on the table, a younger version of himself, arms raised in victory, a championship belt slung over his shoulder. Beside him in the photo was his trainer, a man with a proud smile and an arm draped around Zay's shoulders. Zay picked up the photo, his fingers brushing over the faces. He hadn't fought in years. Not since the night it all went wrong. The cheers of the crowd had been deafening, the adrenaline surging through him as he stood victorious in the ring. But the victory had come at a cost. The next day, his trainer, his mentor, had been attacked outside the gym by a rival fighter's crew. They had taken their anger out on the one person Zay cared about most. His mentor survived, but barely. The guilt had eaten at Zay, driving him to hang up his gloves for good. He hadn't thrown a punch since. But now, the shadows of his past felt closer than ever. The gang's actions weren't just threats to the station. They were reminders of the violence Zay had spent years trying to escape. He set the photo down, his jaw tightening. If they wanted a fight, he wouldn't go looking for it. But he wouldn't run either. The gang's grip on the station tightened, their presence growing bolder with each passing day. Zay continued his quiet resistance, helping where he could, watching, waiting. The tension between him and Slim was a taut wire, ready to snap. And Zay knew, when it did, there would be no turning back. The subway station was nearly deserted, the late hour draping the space in an eerie stillness. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the platform. Zay sat on his usual bench, his large frame slouched slightly as he read from a well-worn paperback. The rhythmic hum of an approaching train echoed faintly in the distance, but the platform itself was silent. Until it wasn't. The sound of footsteps broke the quiet, a heavy, deliberate rhythm that was all too familiar. Zay didn't look up immediately. He didn't need to. The gang had arrived. Marcus Slim Taylor led the way, his lanky frame silhouetted under the harsh lights. His signature smirk was firmly in place, though his eyes gleamed with something darker, vengeance. Behind him, the gang spread out, their presence filling the station with an oppressive weight. Well, Slim drawled, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. Look who decided to keep the bench warm for us. Zay closed his book calmly, resting it beside him on the bench. He looked up, meeting Slim's gaze with quiet resolve. Evening, Zay said evenly, his deep voice carrying across the platform. Slim's smirk twisted into a sneer. You've been making quite the habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, old man. The gang chuckled, their laughter sharp and mocking. One of them, a broad-shouldered man nicknamed Tank, cracked his knuckles loudly, the sound like stones grinding together. I just mind my own business, Zay replied, his tone steady. Maybe you should try it sometime. The gang surged closer, their semicircle tightening around Zay. Slim tilted his head, his grin turning predatory. See, that's the thing, Slim said, taking a step forward. This is our business now. And you've been stepping on it. The tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. Tank lunged first, his meaty hand grabbing Zay's book and flinging it to the floor. What you gonna do now? Ha, Tank growled, stepping closer. Zay's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. His voice remained calm, but there was a razor-sharp edge to it. Pick it up. Tank laughed, glancing back at Slim for approval. The gang leader gestured lazily, as if encouraging the show. What if I don't? Tank asked, leaning in. Pick it up, Zay repeated, his voice dropping a notch, the warning unmistakable. The other gang members jeered, their taunts ringing out as Slim crossed his arms, watching with amusement. But before Tank could escalate further, a faint sound drew everyone's attention, a stifled cry. Near the edge of the platform, a young woman with a child clutched to her side was trying to slip past unnoticed. She froze when one of Slim's men blocked her path. Leaving so soon, the man sneered, stepping closer. The child whimpered, burying his face in his mother's coat. Zay's eyes flicked toward the scene, his expression hardening. He rose slowly, his massive frame towering over the gang. Let them go, Zay said, his voice cutting through the noise. Slim laughed, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Oh, you're giving orders now, he motioned to his man, who yanked the woman's arm. The child cried out, the sound sharp and desperate. That was it. Zay moved. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward and grabbed Tank's arm mid-swing. The gang member's eyes widened as Zay's grip tightened like a vice. Big mistake, Zay growled. Before Tank could react, Zay delivered a quick, devastating jab to his solar plexus. The punch was so precise, so forceful, that Tank crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. The gang froze, their bravado evaporating as they stared at Tank writhing on the ground. What the hell? Slim began. But Zay didn't give him time to finish. Another gang member lunged at him, swinging a metal pipe. Zay sidestepped effortlessly, his years of training kicking in. He ducked low, pivoted, and landed an uppercut that sent the attacker sprawling onto the platform. The man groaned, clutching his jaw as he rolled onto his side. "Stop him," Slim barked, his voice tinged with panic. The remaining gang members hesitated, but their loyalty or fear of Slim pushed them forward. Two came at Zay simultaneously, one brandishing a knife and the other swinging a chain. Zay's movements were a blur. He deflected the knife with a calculated swipe of his forearm, stepping into the attacker's space and driving a powerful left hook into his ribs. The man staggered back, wheezing. The chain-wielding attacker tried to catch Zay off guard, swinging the heavy links in a wide arc. But Zay ducked low, closing the distance in an instant. He grabbed the chain mid-swing, yanked it free, and used it to deliver a bone-jarring strike to the man's shoulder. The attacker howled in pain, dropping to his knees. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. Phones were out, capturing every second. Slim was the last man standing, his earlier confidence replaced by fury and fear. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket, the blade gleaming under the harsh lights. "This isn't over," Slim spat, advancing cautiously. Zay stood his ground, his fists raised, his eyes locked on Slim. His breathing was steady, his stance unshakable. "You don't want to do this," Zay warned. Slim hesitated, his grip on the knife tightening. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, the defeated gang, the onlookers, the cameras. He took a step back. "We'll be back," Slim snarled, his voice trembling as he pointed the blade at Zay. "You can count on that." Zay didn't respond. He simply stared, his silence more intimidating than any threat. Slim turned and fled, his gang scrambling after him. Their retreat was messy, their humiliation palpable. The platform was silent, save for the whispers of the crowd and the faint hum of the arriving train. Zay bent down and picked up his book, dusting it off before turning to the young mother and her child. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her son tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Zay offered a small nod, then turned back to his bench. He sat down, opened his book, and resumed reading as if nothing had happened. But the air in the station had shifted. The people around him looked at him differently now, with respect, awe, and a glimmer of hope. The quiet hero had revealed a side of himself they hadn't expected. And though the gang had fled, Zay knew they would return. Next time, he'd be ready. The subway station, once a buzzing yet manageable hub of urban life, had taken on a darker edge. The echoes of laughter and conversation were replaced by whispers of unease, the casual pace of commuters disrupted by quickened steps and furtive glances. The gang wasn't gone. They were biding their time, and the effects of their retaliation were beginning to ripple through the station. It started subtly, vandalized posters on the station walls, the remnants of spray paint, declaring Slim's crew rules, broken windows at the newsstand, shattered by bricks that had appeared overnight, left the vendor visibly shaken as he cleaned up the mess. The busker who had once serenaded passersby now packed up early, his eyes darting nervously as he avoided Slim's men lounging near the turnstiles. Then it became personal. Zay sat on his usual bench, his jaw tightening as he watched a young man, Jason, a subway employee who'd once helped an elderly commuter Zay had intervened for, get cornered by two gang members. "What's the rush?" One of them sneered, blocking Jason's path. "You in some kind of hurry to play hero, just like your buddy over there." Zay's hands curled into fists as he rose from the bench, but before he could step in, Jason caught his eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. The young man's face was tight with fear, but he managed to stammer out, "I don't want trouble." The gang member smirked, grabbing Jason's collar. "Oh, there's no trouble," he hissed. "Unless you make it." The tension snapped when Zay approached, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the scene. "He's not your problem," Zay said evenly, his voice a low rumble that made both men turn. The gang members exchanged glances, the memory of their defeat still fresh. They released Jason, retreating with muttered curses, but their glares lingered, promising payback. "Thanks," Jason said shakily, brushing off his uniform. "But you can't keep doing this, Zay. They'll come for you again. Harder this time." Zay didn't answer immediately. He simply watched as the two gang members disappeared into the shadows. That evening, Zay found himself back at the bench, staring at his reflection in the darkened window of a passing train. He had been here before, pulled into fights that escalated into cycles of violence, each harder to walk away from than the last. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Evelyn, a subway janitor he'd come to know over the years, stood nearby, a mop in one hand and a cautious smile on her face. "You're thinking about leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Zay shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "I don't belong here anymore, Evelyn. They're targeting anyone who even looks at me." She set her mop aside and sat down next to him. "Do you think they'll stop if you leave? They'll just find someone else to push around. Someone who can't fight back." Zay's shoulders slumped, her words striking a nerve. "You're the only reason half the people here still feel safe," Evelyn continued. "You've got a chance to make this right. To show them they don't own this place." Her words lingered long after she left, echoing in his mind as he wrestled with the weight of responsibility versus the life he had tried so hard to leave behind. As Zay leaned back, closing his eyes, memories surfaced, vivid and unrelenting. The roar of the crowd filled his ears, drowning out his own thoughts. He was back in the ring, delivering blow after calculated blow. His opponent staggered, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. The referee stepped in, but the damage was already done. After the match, Zay remembered looking down at his hands, swollen and raw, and wondering how much longer he could keep doing this. The money was good, but each fight took a piece of him. Then came the night he walked away. A match had gone too far, his opponent carried out on a stretcher, his family sobbing in the stands. Zay had won, but it didn't feel like victory. That was the night he promised himself he'd never use his fists to hurt again. But now, in this subway station, he wondered if he had been wrong. Maybe some fights were worth taking on. Miles away, Marcus "Slim" Taylor sat in a dimly lit garage, surrounded by his bruised and battered crew. The humiliation of their defeat was still fresh, and the memory of Zay's unshakable composure burned in Marcus's mind. "Next time, we don't take chances," Marcus snapped, slamming a fist onto the table. "He humiliated us in front of everyone. We're not just going to let that slide." Tank, still nursing his bruised ribs, leaned forward. "What's the plan, Slim?" Marcus's smirk returned, sharp and dangerous. "We bring in backup. There's plenty of guys who'd love a chance to take down a so-called tough guy. And this time, we bring the heat." He motioned to the pile of weapons on the table, knives, chains, and even a few makeshift bats. "This isn't just about teaching him a lesson," Marcus continued. "We make an example out of him. In front of everyone." The gang murmured their agreement, their anger reigniting as Marcus outlined his plan. "Tomorrow night," he said, his tone final. "The station's going to be ours, and Zay? He won't know what hit him." As the night deepened, Zay stood at the edge of the platform, the distant rumble of an approaching train filling the silence. The subway station felt heavier now, the atmosphere thick with an unspoken threat. He knew they would come back. He knew they wouldn't fight fair. But this time, neither would he. The subway station was unusually crowded, the hum of evening commuters blending with the rhythmic clatter of approaching trains. Laughter echoed from a group of teens on the platform, and a street performer's guitar strummed softly in the background. The atmosphere seemed ordinary, almost peaceful, but Zay knew better. He stood near the central pillar, his broad frame half-shadowed, his sharp eyes scanning the bustling station. His instincts told him tonight was the night. A loud, deliberate whistle cut through the noise. Zay's gaze snapped toward the stairs as Marcus "Slim" Taylor appeared, flanked by a larger-than-usual crew. Their swagger was exaggerated, their presence intimidating, and their intent clear. Commuters began to scatter, sensing the danger. Parents pulled their children closer. Vendors shut their stalls. The station's heartbeat quickened, its fragile sense of safety unraveling. Marcus stepped forward, a bat resting on his shoulder, his sharp grin radiating malice. "Evening, champ," he called out, his voice mocking. "You didn't think we'd let things slide, did you?" Zay's jaw tightened. He glanced around the station, noting escape routes and potential hazards. "You don't want to do this, Marcus," he said evenly. Marcus chuckled, gesturing to his crew, who began fanning out, cutting off exits and trapping bystanders. "Oh, I think I do. Tonight, we settle the score." One of the gang members, armed with a chain, lunged at Zay. Zay sidestepped the attack, his movement deceptively smooth for his size. He countered with a precise uppercut to the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. The crowd erupted into screams, people surging toward the exits. In the chaos, Zay moved with purpose, guiding a terrified mother and her child toward a safer corner. "Stay low," he urged, his voice firm but calm. More attackers rushed at him. A man wielding a metal pipe swung for Zay's head, But Zay ducked, countering with a body blow that left the man gasping for air. Another came from behind, brandishing a knife. Zay turned, catching the attacker's wrist mid-swing and twisting it sharply until the blade clattered to the ground. The fight was brutal, but Zay remained focused, his boxing instincts driving his every move. His training came back like muscle memory, sidestepping blows, reading his opponent's movements, and striking with precision. As the gang faltered, Marcus stepped forward, his bat tapping the ground with every step. "You've got moves?" Old man Marcus sneered, tossing the bat aside and raising his fists. "But let's see how you handle me." Zay squared his shoulders, his stance shifting into a boxer's guard. "You've got heart, kid," he said, his tone tinged with disappointment. "But that won't save you." Marcus lunged, his punches wild and fueled by rage. Zay weaved effortlessly, dodging each strike with the precision of a seasoned fighter. He countered with a jab to Marcus's ribs, the impact drawing a pained grunt. "Stay still," Marcus roared, swinging again. Zay didn't oblige. He stepped inside Marcus's reach, landing a devastating hook that sent the younger man stumbling backward. "You're not disciplined," Zay said, his voice calm even as he advanced. "You fight angry. That's why you'll lose." Marcus snarled, throwing a desperate haymaker. Zay caught his wrist, twisting it, and forcing Marcus to his knees. The remaining gang members hesitated, their confidence shattered as they watched Marcus struggle. Some dropped their weapons, retreating toward the stairs, while others stood frozen, unsure whether to flee or fight. "Anyone else?" Zay called out, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Silence followed. Marcus, still on his knees, glared up at Zay, his face a mix of fury and humiliation. "This isn't over," he spat. Zay's grip tightened. "Yes, it is." With a final shove, he released Marcus, sending him sprawling to the ground. Police sirens wailed in the distance, their approach sending the remaining gang members scattering. Commuters began to re-emerge cautiously, their faces a mix of relief and awe. Zay stood in the center of the station, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. Around him lay the remnants of the fight, discarded weapons, groaning attackers, and the shattered grip Marcus's gang once held over the station. A young boy stepped forward, his wide eyes filled with admiration. "Mister, you're a hero," he said softly. Zay's expression softened. He crouched to the boy's level, his voice gentle. "I'm just someone who stands up when it's needed." The station, though battered, felt lighter now, a place reclaimed. Zay straightened, his gaze settling on Marcus, who was being dragged away by the police. The fight was over, but its impact would linger. Zay had done more than defend himself, he had reminded the station, and the people in it, that courage could overcome fear. The subway station hummed with cautious energy the next morning. The aftermath of the fight lingered in the air, but the station was no longer weighed down by fear. Broken glass had been swept up, graffiti scrubbed away, and benches righted. Commuters moved through the space with a tentative sense of safety, their wary glances replaced by murmurs of gratitude and curiosity. Zay stood near the turnstiles, his broad shoulders relaxed but his gaze sharp. He watched as officers led Marcus and his gang toward waiting squad cars, their hands cuffed and heads lowered. Marcus's defiance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen silence. Detective Carla Vega, a sharp-eyed officer with a commanding presence, approached Zay, her notepad tucked under one arm. She extended her hand. "Isaiah Johnson, right?" she said, her tone professional but warm. Zay nodded, shaking her hand. "I've heard a lot about you from witnesses. What you did here, it's not something we see often. You stood up when no one else would." "I did what needed to be done," Zay replied, his deep voice steady. "This place deserved better than them." Detective Vega smiled faintly. "Well, you've made it easier for us to do our job. With the witnesses' statements and the evidence we've gathered, these guys won't be bothering anyone for a long time." Zay nodded, his gaze drifting to the commuters who had begun to return to their routines. As the officers departed with the gang, people approached Zay hesitantly at first. An older woman with a cane stepped forward, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "They had us all so scared. But you stood up to them. You gave us hope." Zay nodded, offering her a kind smile. "You're welcome, ma'am. Just looking out for the neighborhood." A young man in a hoodie chimed in, "Man, you were incredible. The way you handled them, straight out of a movie." Zay chuckled softly, his humility apparent. "Just doing what I know how to do. Later, as the station quieted, Zay found a secluded bench and sat down, his hands resting on his knees. The adrenaline had faded, leaving him with the familiar ache of a hard fight. But this time it was more than physical exhaustion. This fight had stirred something deeper. He thought of the life he'd left behind, the arenas, the lights, the cheers. That world had defined him for years, but it had also drained him. Walking away had been an act of survival, a way to reclaim his humanity. But now, for the first time, he saw his past as something more than a shadow. Protecting this community, using his skills for something meaningful, it felt like redemption. As the evening approached, Zay rose and made his way toward the station exit. Along the way, he paused to exchange nods and smiles with the people he passed. A child waved at him from her mother's arms, and Zay waved back, his expression softening. Near the turnstiles, Detective Vega stopped him. "Leaving already?" she asked. "For now," Zay said. "But if you need me, you know where to find me." Vega studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Take care, Zay. This neighborhood's lucky to have you." Outside, the city was alive with its usual chaos: car horns, street vendors, and the chatter of passers-by. Zay walked with a steady gait, his silhouette imposing against the backdrop of the evening sky. He glanced back at the station once more, a faint smile playing on his lips. The battle was over, but the fight for the neighborhood's peace was far from finished. He knew there were always shadows waiting to creep in. But for now, he had done his part. And he was ready, should the need arise again. Zay disappeared into the crowd, a quiet protector leaving behind a legacy of courage and hope in the hearts of those he had saved.